distributed, talked about wind and geothermal, but here the big movement has been, so far anyway, has been with PV, distributed PV.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about the potential for that in conjunction with concentrating solar power? But yeah.
Well, if you look at the report that I was mentioning, essentially what we did in that study, a lot of these studies are top-down studies. You have analysts and they look at sort of what's needed and how you can meet those needs. We did the opposite. We did a bottoms-up study. We went to each of the areas and we got experts. We got an expert in biofuels, biomass, photovoltaics, concentrating solar power, wind, geothermal, and efficiency. And we asked each of those experts, how much could you do in terms of reducing U.S. carbon emissions by 2030? And we added them all up. They map out into this wedges chart. So in answer to your question about PV, that number came out to a peak of 200,000 megawatts of PV installed. Now that's peak. PV has a relatively low capacity factor. That is, it's not tracking the sun, it's facing in one direction, and so the ratio of its average power to its peak power is only about 17, 18%. So it turned out that 200,000 megawatts of peak PV, and that's like at solar noon when it's facing the sun, it would be putting out all this power. That saved about as much carbon emissions as the 80,000 megawatts of concentrating solar power, because the 80,000 megawatts of concentrating solar power had a capacity factor of 42% because it had 6 hours of thermal storage. It was actually generating electricity after the sun sets, just like the Solana plant is going to do outside of Phoenix. It's going to have 6 hours of storage as sun sets. It'll have a capacity factor of probably 40, 42%, something like that. So that would answer your question that in terms of total energy produced, the PV was about the same as the concentrating solar, even though the peak power was higher for photovoltaics. And the biggest energy contributor of all in the time frame of 2030 was wind power. And we were looking at 245,000 megawatts of wind power being installed with a capacity factor of maybe 35%, something like that.
And do those numbers include the difference of efficiency when you have distributed power that the transmission is essentially nil? So you don't build any more lines, all of that?
Yeah, I mean, the PV study was done distributed, and where that really kind of enters into the cost. The PV competes against the retail price of electricity as opposed to against the wholesale price of electricity, and that helps. I have to say that, of all the studies that were done in the Tackling Climate Change report, I thought the PV one was fairly optimistic. Installing 200,000 megawatts on rooftops between now and 2030 is not an easy undertaking. And of all the wedges that are in that study, it's probably the one that maybe I have the lowest confidence in, and I have to say my confidence has improved lately because we only looked at rooftop, and we are now seeing the success of these central PV systems that are flat PV modules but on one-axis trackers. Okay, they are aligned north and south, and they track the sun from morning to evening, and we have a large, I think it's a 800 kilowatt installation at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory now. So I think when you look at a combination of distributed and central, we might be able to get that 200,000 megawatts peak. And I have to say that I don't like to get in this debate between central and distributed, because if you look at the climate change issue and how serious it is, and it's been very underplayed in the United States because there's a lot of misinformation in the press. But if you look at how serious the carbon issue is, we can't afford to be choosy and say, gee, we like this distributed concept better than the central. We need to do both, I think.
Yeah, and for that as well, in Texas, with the solar resource being, Texas is often quoted as having the most solar resource because the land area, the quality is lower than here in the desert Southwest. So Austin Energy, where I'm from, in Austin, Texas, the city utility has sort of had an outgoing request for proposals for a CSP project for land that they have leased in West Texas where the resource is better. But the first major solar plant they've gone with is a 30 megawatt facility that's just to the east or right by Austin. So in terms of their portfolio, what they saw made the most sense was a PV facility, large-scale PV facility instead of CSP. San Antonio down the road has engaged with, I think, Sterling to try to do a power purchase agreement with the Sterling systems that are based in more in West Texas. So there's a mix of things in Texas, and even though the regulatory environment there is much easier than I think out here in the West in terms of getting permitting process, the resource is a little worse, but some of the progressive utilities are trying to move forward, and the power prices are just less, so there's a little bit less incentive to go for the solar there versus California, where the power prices at least double. Being the large natural gas producer that Texas is, it kind of keeps the prices low for electricity.
I'd like to ask a question about the so-called barriers to enter this concentrated solar power industry. How much do you think is actually the general consumer environmentalist who is standing in the way? Is that, we have the economic issues, we have, so I'm wondering, in part this is what is help, what will most, what do you think will most help concentrated solar power move forward?
I would say that per se there's no one or no thing standing in the way. Projects are moving forward. The regulatory agencies are by and large understand what we're trying to do, but of course they need to be stewards of the environment, and we're working closely together. We're dealing with the water issues, we're dealing with the transmission issues. We see the local communities where these projects are going in as being very, very supportive. We talk about these places being remote areas. Well, there are communities there, and sometimes jobs are tough to come by, and so the local communities are very, very supportive of our projects, and have been very helpful in helping us make the case that overall they're a valuable asset to add. So, but these, for the kinds of projects my company's been involved in, which are very large bulk power facilities, they are large undertakings, big infrastructure projects, and they do take time, and there's lots of complexities to them. So I do think that as these initial rounds of projects get approved, there'll be some lessons learned on everyone's standpoint, the developer's standpoint, the local community, regulatory agencies, and the policy folks. So we learn about these initial, do the next round, and I think they're overall pretty healthy. We still get blind on some things that I might call quirky, but one's a fringe-toed lizard, expert, and life too, that's important to them, and so we're dealing with it. So I tribulations, and it's a tough one, but overall, I don't see barriers to overcome. I think we're working through issues, having a lot of success, and like I said, I look at lessons point a year or two from now, catch your breath, and kind of move to the next phase of development.
Have you learned some specific lessons right now?
I would say we just had reinforced notions that we felt as we got into this. So, for instance, regular dialogue with what you communities from CBD to Sierra Club, all part of our constituency that we work with to figure out where we're going to go next. Water. The thing that we talked a little bit about is transmission. So now we got to work more closely stages with touch on it all, but very critical